Hello, and welcome to another episode of Arvos of Harvo. There is a very loud train outside. It is December now, and so we're rolling through the books of November. We're going to do it a bit quickly because I've read quite a bit, but I'm going to stop myself before I say some undue negative things because I have many, many thoughts. The weird coincidence that happened with all the books that I read this month, a lot of them happen to be debuts, and I think as a reader I've found that I quite like structure, I quite like planning and forethought, and that's something that just doesn't really happen in a lot of debut works, and it's no fault of the author, right? No one should be expected to be amazing as they're just starting out. But anyways, here are the books for this month. Forgot to clap, so this is what I have. Everything is heavy, it's very heavy, bigger than it needs to be, but alright, let's just get into it. Alright, so book one is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Kesey. This is a rather hard-hitting book. It's set in a psychiatry ward in the 1960s, back around the time when lobotomies and other really invasive psychiatric treatment was quite common. And it stars a character pretending to be mute, who's a Native American, and he is observing this ward and all the happenings with it. And it so happens the novel begins with a new patient named McMurphy. He arrives at the hospital and he's kind of like this agent of chaos, right? We're not even really sure if he has a diagnosed mental illness or not, but he's used his situation to get himself out of a sentence for a very serious crime. And so we see his interaction between this new patient McMurphy and Nurse Ratched, who runs this ward in a really overt and domineering way. She controls how everybody interacts with each other. She controls kind of the divisions of the ward between the people who are going to be there forever and the people who might be there briefly and then be released afterwards. She kind of determines the types of treatment and the types of amenities that people get. And McMurphy, as an individual, is really pushing against every kind of authority or organized society within this. So in this mental institution, we have this small microcosm of people who each have their own little role to play, and McMurphy trying to win people over from others who are very complacently satisfied with being controlled by Nurse Ratched. It's interesting. It feels very 60s. It's one of the novels that came out of the Beat generation, and it really shows, especially in the dream sequences from the protagonist. For the most part, our narrator is very eloquent, is very thoughtful, is very descriptive with the way that he sees the world, so it's really clear what the experiences of the other characters are until the paranoia kind of takes hold, and we get these vivid and confusing dream sequences that start to take on a rhythmic quality of their own, which reminds me very much of the Beat generation style, right? And so it's interesting to try and meld back and forth between these realistic and very harrowing depictions of psychiatry in the 1960s and then going into just very paranoid, otherworldly scenes of just what could possibly be the reason for the quite negative experiences of the characters here. It flows very nicely, it's very easy to read, even when the things get quite dark and heavy. There's still quite a bit of humor here. There's a lot of fun poked at the experiences of the characters. At times, it did feel a little bit mean-spirited, especially because we're dealing with characters who are varying degrees of mentally unwell, but it does have a lot of heart. I feel like there's a lot of kind moments that exist, and yeah, it's a lot. It's very chaotic. A lot of different things are going on. I would give this a 3 out of 5, but it's really significant. I'm also told the film's quite significant too. I have not seen it, but yeah, that's it. That's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Book 2 for November is Watership Down by Richard Adams. This is probably the easiest of the big books I've done this year. It's ostensibly a children's book, technically a children's book, doesn't feel like one, because the entire time I read this I was thinking, wow, Richard Adams is a man who went to war. Like, he's been to war. He is completely dissatisfied with any narrative that isn't bleak and dark and gruesome, because this is about rabbits. One day, a kind of clairvoyant rabbit named Fiver sees a vision that their home warren is going to be torn down and replaced with an apartment complex, and so he gathers anyone who will believe him, led by the leader Rabbit Hazel, and they go all the way across the English countryside trying to find a place that will work for them. And on the way they find a bunch of different rabbit warrens with their own organizations, and they have struggles and perils and battles and victories, and it's just this big long epic of these rabbits trying to find their home. And it's really dark and bleak and violent, and it's surprising that the author decided that this would be the thing that they would give to kids, because it's very much a kind of Odyssey type text. It reminds me very strongly of the Aeneid, which is the epic poem that I'm most familiar with, having done Latin in high school. But if you've read anything like the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, probably, like any kind of epic poetry, this really resonates with that style of storytelling, because we've got our protagonist who's not really the strongest or the smartest or anything like that. The Rabbit Hazel is kind of just a good leader. He's good at convincing other people to get on his side. We've got the strong Rabbit Bigwig, we've got the intelligent Rabbit Blackberry, we've got Fiver, who has some kind of mystical ability to tell the future, and they all gather together on this journey. And they go through perils in an interesting way. It's not so much one big hero's journey where every new step is an escalation. Instead, it's just highs and lows, right? It's joys and it's pitfalls, and when it does go low, it goes very, very low. There's really, really bleak moments here, and we get a sense of rabbits as a type of character or a life form, as being a bit of an underdog. There's this recurring motif of a myth of the rabbit named El something. I've immediately forgotten because it's been too long since I read this. El Alhira, I believe. And it's a prankster archetype, right? This is a rabbit who, through ingenuity and trickery, is able to attain safety for himself and the rabbits under his care. And there's this sense that rabbits survive due to their determination and their ingenuity, even though they are beset by so many different predators that are out to get them. And so reading this book, you do feel that kind of paranoia of being this really tiny creature in a world that really just does not care for you, right? And just seeing danger at every turn and trying your best to take care of the people that you are in charge of. Again, can't believe this is a kid book. Really surprised this is a kid book. If you read this as a child, are you okay? Are you happy? Are you healthy? Please tell me that you're okay after reading this. Every chapter actually even begins with a quotation from classic literature. We get things like The Art of War, the Iliad, the Shakespeare. I'm just wondering which small child is getting all these references. My only guess is that every epigraph is there to give the author a bit of structure for what's happening there and to connect the book to a much more lofty literary angle. But gosh, what a strange time this was. It is a fun adventure book, and I do recommend reading it because of just how much energy it has, how many different situations you get, but it is not a joyful time. It is very bleak and dangerous, and yeah, that's Watership down. I would give this also a 3 out of 5. Book 3 for November, A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian. I knew nothing about this. This is my Globetrotter for November. It's set in Ukraine. And yeah, I don't know what to say about this. It's a debut. It's a debut for this author, and I think the difficult thing that this book endured, and the reason why it didn't review fantastically, is because it's marketed as a comedy. It's marketed very strongly as a book that is funny, that'll make you laugh. Everything about the cover, the title, the promotions, it's trying to say it's a funny novel. And I would say this is a comic novel, but it's not a funny book. It's a book about comic situations, but I had a real hard time laughing, and that seems to be a common experience with a lot of the people I've seen who've read this book, is they don't find it funny. And it's because of how extreme the situation is. The premise is that we follow this middle-aged woman who's in her 30s or maybe early 40s, and her father, very old father, has started a relationship and wants to marry this woman from Ukraine because, well, it's very clearly a sham marriage. The woman is significantly younger than him, and it's very clearly to get a visa to come to the UK, and also because the father has a bit of money that the woman wants, right? We get the sense that this is just a horrible situation for the father to be in, but our protagonist and our protagonist's sister have this debate about how they can get this gold digger out of their family tree, family house. Does it sound funny? Because it's really not. It's quite bleak. There's descriptions of the father and his experiences as a widow and as a refugee from the conflicts of Ukraine, and the contrast between the historical Ukraine and the modern Ukraine, which does create characters like Valentina the gold digger, who want nothing but success for themselves and their family and will take any circumstance, any costs to try and get that for them, right? And you don't feel sympathetic for any of these characters, even though it's a book about refugees and about trying to make your own place in a new environment and trying to overcome the oftentimes very difficult family and history of your country. It doesn't feel compassionate. Instead, it loves to make fun of each of these characters. Valentina is grotesque and her desires are often exaggerated. The father is shown as a bumbling fool because he would let himself be scammed so easily. Even the protagonist is shown as quite a negative figure for her desire to manipulate and meddle in this relationship. No one comes off particularly well. And even through each of these escalations of this gold-digging relationship, and then eventually the court case to try and get the father out with as much of his belongings left as they can, you don't laugh. You just feel a bit grim. And if you're a person that loves to make fun of other people's misfortunes, maybe you would have a good time here. But I didn't. I had a hard time reading this. I would give this a 2 out of 5. I did find it funny, though, that the reason why the novel is called A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian is because of the subplot where the protagonist's father is trying to write this fictional non-fiction book cataloging the evolution of tractors and also weaving in a bit of Ukrainian history into there. Those were interstitial moments in the novel that I actually found to be quite fun, and it was one of the few things that really did humanize the father in my eyes, even though the book itself seems to treat it as this really silly, inconsequential project. And I also have to note that this book, as a debut, does feel quite messy. It's not plotted very clearly. There is a subplot between the protagonist and her sister and their disagreements about the mother's will. They have a subplot about Valentina's son and his attempts to try and integrate into an English school. They have all these little extra bits that don't resolve themselves super neatly by the end. And I think that's a consequence of debut novels, is that if you're integrating a little bit of life experience, or if you have a few stories in your head, there's this big temptation to try and tell all of them. And sometimes subplots which don't really assist the main novel work their way in, because as a debut writer you don't necessarily know what a complete story looks or feels like. You don't know sometimes if you want to add more things or take away more things, because you don't feel like you're an author yet, right? You feel like you're writing one work, whereas as you develop in your career, I think you might think more in terms of premises, right? This is the book where you do this, and that one's the book where you do that. Whereas working on a debut, you're just getting everything that you know and everything you enjoy into one book, and that's what feels like is happening here, is that it is a messy combination of a bunch of different stories about sibling conflicts and gold digging and migration and refugees and tractors. And the marketing team went, well, what's the one thing we can latch onto in this huge pool of different influences? And they went comedy, and they went, let's call this book a comedy and sell it, right? And so as much as it tries to be a comic novel, it doesn't succeed on that front. And I wish it were more focused, but I do like that it exists, and I am glad that I had the chance to read it. It is, however, still a 2 out of 5. Okay, next book for November is Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is a book I was supposed to read in year 11 and I did not finish, and reading it now I very clearly see why. Because as a teenager I would have called this extremely difficult, not well paced at all, hard to put together, and tangenty, very tangenty. And now as an adult with understanding of historical context and why this book might be significant, now I can appreciate it, and now I really did enjoy it. And amazingly, this means that I have now finished every book that I was assigned to read in high school, I think. There is probably one or two I'm still missing. But out of all the ones that I remember from year 11 and 12 that I know for a fact I did not finish, Dracula was the last. No, I'm lying. I'm lying. There are more books I had to go get to. But Dracula was one of the books. It's been 10 years since I graduated high school, and I'm still working through this list. But Dracula was one of the books I was supposed to read, and I did finish it, so that is a small win for me. This is a book that's epistolary. It's told through letters and journal entries and a bunch of extra supplementary material. It's got newspaper articles. It's just got a bunch of stuff, right? And it's the kind of book where you do need to put the work in to figure out what's happening. We get characters who are very flawed and very unaware of vampire mythology, and that's the reason why they end up in the bad situation that they are in. Jonathan Harker goes to Dracula's castle not knowing that he's about to meet a vampire, and he's just walking around these gothic castle halls being like, oh, these rooms are locked. Oh, he doesn't appear in a mirror. Oh, he's terrified of this, and he never appears at night. Weird, right? And so there's the dramatic irony being created there where the audience is expected to know certain things, and if you don't catch on to this, the reading experience is quite frustrating because you are constantly switching characters and perspectives. Other characters don't seem to really contribute to the plot at all. For example, Van Helsing, who is famously now a vampire hunter character. In this book, he's a professor. He's trying to find knowledge, and he often doesn't know very clearly what he's doing. He will try different rituals, he'll experiment, he'll go off on tangents, he'll explain what he's trying to do, and the other character will just not believe him. And this is all fine if you were to have that presupposed knowledge of what vampires fear or where vampires come from or what the kind of morality of these times were like, because vampires are often represented metaphorically as a transgression of morality in the otherwise a very stuffy Victorian era that this book was written in. So having had that knowledge, I really enjoyed reading this. I significantly enjoyed the way everything was put together, because even though it has that diary entry format, and even though we switch between characters, if you latch on to the purpose of each passage and paragraph and character, and you can start making these connections between what otherwise seems quite disparate to these characters, it is a really phenomenal reading experience, because you're making theories or you're hypothesizing, you recognize the fear that is about to approach these characters before they even realize it. The dramatic irony here is managed really, really well, but it does take that little bit of effort, right? I think that overall, getting better at reading this year has helped me appreciate this, whereas if I was just starting out and I wanted a fun vampire adventure story, this is not it, right? This is not that. I also find it interesting that my edition that I have here seems to love the interpretation that this book is an allegory for the Irish-English relationship. So when I was in high school, I had to write an essay about how this book is a representative of xenophobia, and it absolutely is, right? It absolutely has that narrative of Dracula being an Eastern European, almost Asian figure who's infiltrating England and trying to spread foreignness in England, and the characters are all a bunch of British stereotypes trying to beat back the foreign invasion. That narrative is definitely there, and be aware of it if you're going into this. This is a unforgivably racist book. It's not even accidentally a racist, it's very overtly racist. But it is also quite interesting in the lens of its Irish allegory of spirituality being a solution to science and rationality. In the Victorian era, when there were more and more discoveries of technology and how the world worked and natural processes, this is a book which seems to suggest that various things, right? Superstitions, faith, myths, legends, the occult, spirituality, all of these things are valid defenses, because if we relinquish them and if we only rely on things like modern technology, we will be very vulnerable to spiritual forces which do exist. And I find it interesting the way that technology and historical or traditional knowledge is combined in this text, because there are still lots of motifs of typewriters and trains and telegrams and new things, right? And they are all tools that the characters use to try and fight Dracula. But ultimately, it's a combination between the old and the new which is successful. And if you were a massive nerd, you would enjoy that reading, right? You would enjoy the ability of piecing together the kinds of different themes and influences that must have affected Bram Stoker in his representation of Dracula. Just what the evil represents, what the good represents, how does the good overcome the evil, and what tools does each character have at their disposal. There's a fun board game about that, apparently, but I did not have the time to do that. I just read that as a fun adventure story. It took me some time to get through, but I enjoyed it, so I will give it a 4 out of 5. I do not dock points for racism. I really should. Why did I say that? Okay, book 5 is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I often call Truman Capote probably in my top 5 favorite authors, and this book really proves it, right? I had just read Breakfast at Tiffany's and some short stories before, and despite those stories not really being about anything, like Breakfast at Tiffany's is just not a very plotty book at all. The individual sentences and the way that the sentences flow onto paragraphs and the way the imagery and the characterization all comes together, it's very, very beautiful. I genuinely can't explain why his sentences are so good, but every time I read his work, it just feels warm and enveloping and heartening, and I get an incredibly complex picture of humanity in a very sympathetic way, right? I would say that's one of his greatest strengths, is he can make beautiful sentences that will make you love any character. And I was so surprised that he would turn this attention to a story of a gruesome murder of a family, right? Which is exactly what he does in Cold Blood. He represents the case against 2 travelers who end up killing a full family in rural Kansas for no apparent reason. And he traces the trial from the discovery of the bodies to the interrogation of various suspects to the revelation that these 2 murderers, Perry and Hickok, have done it, and then their eventual sentence and the death penalty that arises, right? So through this whole time, we are given a clear and oftentimes quite empathetic portrait of the 2 murderers. And even from the very beginning, we know their perspective. We are constantly questioning why they are the way they are, why they've done what they've done. We get these interviews between the police and their family, and with people who are impacted by the crime, and the victims as well, and people attached to the victims. We know the house inside out, we know every clue inside out. It's meticulous in its detail, and it never feels clinical. It never feels like just a story where you're curious about who did the murder, right? Because even though there is a bit of uncertainty in the beginning, it soon becomes very apparent who's responsible. We are more concerned with why. And this is probably what got this book into such hot water, is because it's difficult to write about these real events and to pretend as an author, no matter how talented you are, that you actually do know the motive behind a person's actions. And it's well documented that quite a few facts were bent in order to make this non-fiction narrative account work. And so I'm sure that the truth is quite far from what we get in this novel. But the experience of reading this, the experience of just getting into the heads of these, at times terrifying, at times very human figures, and trying to reason out and rationalize how they justified their actions, how they arrived at the conclusion they did, and what would be an appropriate way of addressing this type of behavior. It's fascinating and entrancing at the same time. I was just spellbound the entire time. I could not just stop thinking about the book. Even after reading it, I was just thinking so much about these individual characters who, by the end of my reading experience, felt like people I knew, right? Not just like real people, but like familiar people, people that I've personally talked to, people that I've lived my life alongside, that I could really explain who they are. And even in the smallest, most insignificant actions, even in their nervous tics, their casual phrases, their history, their futures, all of these things feel quite intimately connected to me. And it's down to the way the writing is done. It is so well done that it is kind of dangerous. And for that, I have to give it a 5 out of 5. It's just a wonderful, wonderful reading experience. Even if you don't like true crime, I would say this is a book that will get you into true crime. If you love true crime, this is actually not the best example of it, because ultimately it's not so much about the crime as it is about the people who commit it and the people who suffer it. And people, right? Book about people. So that makes it really, really fantastic. 5 out of 5. Okay, book 6 is The Coconut Children by Vivian Pham. This is a book that came out of Western Sydney, southwestern Sydney. It's set in Cabramatta in the 90s when there was this big media blitz about Asian gangs in Cabramatta, people who came from a refugee Vietnamese background selling drugs or like starting up gangs, starting up islands. Cabramatta used to be considered a very dangerous area of Sydney, and this book, I don't want to say romanticizes it, but dramatizes it, right? It's a coming-of-age story set in this area following a young girl named Sunny who goes to the local high school, and a young man named Vince who's just gotten out of juvenile correction. And it chronicles their friendship, but also each one's relationship to their parents and their journey from Vietnam to Australia, and the way that the various influences of their culture and the society, whether it is the innocent location of a high school to darker influences like the drug culture of 90s Cabramatta, how this influences these characters. It's also a debut, and the author was quite young when she wrote and published this. I followed a few reviews about this as well because I knew quite a bit about this book, having worked in English teaching around the time that it came out. There was a lot of talk about it, and it feels like the author had a lot of fun writing this. That's probably the biggest compliment I can give, is that its melding of genres and of experiences feels like it was done in the name of fun. It has all of these scenes that are some are lighthearted, some are dramatic, but each one is done with a specific mindset of just playing with language and playing with characters, putting characters in situations, mythologizing the history of Cabramatta in a way that is not necessarily authentic or truthful, but is more aligning with certain genre conventions, whether it is the teenage romance or the coming of age or the migrant narrative or a crime drama. I feel like these moments are interspersed across the text where if I'm reading a chapter and I recognize it's trying to play into a certain genre code, I can enjoy it on those terms, and I kind of know, having personal experience, not necessarily growing up in Cabramatta, because I didn't grow up in that area or that time frame, but being from Sydney and knowing a bit more about the culture of southwest Sydney, having worked there, admittedly quite briefly, but having been around that area, having been familiar with the area, having walked around Cabramatta, I think the disbelief of it doesn't ruin the book for me, because I didn't need a book that was an authentic experience of Cabramatta, right? Instead, what I got was scenarios and situations in this mythologized Cabramatta that really played with the situations of being young, coming of age, dealing with questions of responsibility, especially familial or sibling responsibility, and knowing one's place in society if one comes from a position of disadvantage. So all of that is in here, and all of that is kind of shuffled around. There's lots of different flavors of book in here. As a debut, there's a lot in there. And I was aware too that this book is an edited edition that was originally published as part of the Story Factory group in Southwest Sydney and is now being published for Vintage. This edition has quite a lot more description in it. It's a bit more lyrical, there's more phrases there, and the original version, I read only a little bit because of a review in, I think, the Sydney Review of Books. The original version is a bit more stripped back. I don't know which one I necessarily prefer. I think at times the lyrical quality here does get a little bit much, because the book is told from an omniscient perspective, which I really respect because it's such a difficult perspective to pull off. Often, if omniscient doesn't work well, I end up asking the question of, why do I know this thing but not that thing? Why is it more important for me to follow this character and not that character? And when the perspective is working well, I'm just too entertained or entranced or fascinated to care about asking that question. But there are occasionally times here where I got confused because there was a conversation between two characters and I was thinking, whose thoughts am I listening to? Or am I listening to just one or just the other or both? Or is the perspective passing from one character or the other midway through the conversation? I think the attribution of thought and interiority to these characters at times didn't feel fully structured, and I think that is something that can be alleviated just by using first person or third person limited, although that then creates a certain set of problems. I thought that it's interesting because by using omniscient, it allows the author to explore the environment through the perspective of all these different characters. We're not just limited to one individual's experience of Cabramatta, but instead we see it through people who love it and people who hate it, people who treat it as a necessity and people who want nothing more than to be free from it. It's layered and it's detailed, and I don't know if I prefer that to instead getting a more focused text that has one definitive statement about the environment or about the experience of being a refugee or about growing up in Cabramatta. I think the unfocused quality of it lends to the fun, lends to the fact that every chapter I read I don't really know what I'm about to get into, and how everything doesn't really come together, but it also doesn't have to. It doesn't feel like it is rigidly refined and polished to the point where it is a definitive political statement. Instead, it's just a young author writing about some things that they are familiar with and some things they are interested in and having a lot of fun doing it. So I give this a 3 out of 5 for the reading experience, but I think I'm very glad that I got the chance to read this, and I'm very excited to see what else this author will bring in the future. Okay, and the last one for November is Eleanor, Oliphant It's Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. In very many ways a kind of counterpart to The Coconut Children, because this book is now a massive international success. It is also a debut novel from an author who does feel extremely focus grouped. This is a book that has its own little mission statement. It wants to tell the story of an ordinary office worker who doesn't have a lot of friends and experiences the sense of modern loneliness that is so pervasive in our society. And it's also a kind of fun mystery story. How do I articulate this? So it's told from the perspective of this character, Eleanor Oliphant, who's a bit odd. She's an office worker, she's a bit timid, she spends her weeks in the exact same way and her weekends the exact same way. She eats the same food every day, she drinks 2 entire bottles of vodka every weekend, but she does this by herself, right? She doesn't really have any friends, she doesn't go out, she doesn't have any variations to her routine, and she's been doing it this way for years. And as the book begins, we're treated to this individual in this very regimented routine, which is just all that she knows. She's very sheltered. She has conversations with her mother, and her mother seems like to be this corrupting figure that prevents her from being able to make closer bonds and friendships with people around her. And she has this fixated, single-minded plan to marry this rock singer that she saw a single time at a concert and has convinced herself entirely that he is the man of her dreams and they're fated to be together. And it's a bit tragic reading this, because I feel like the positioning of the audience is one of distance. Even though it is a first-person text, the audience is never positioned to feel like they are this character, but rather the character is made so drastically different that the audience pities her, or critiques her, or judges her, or laughs at her, or just recognizes all the moments in their own life when they would have been completely different to her. And this reading experience is so different to anything else that I've experienced this month, is because it felt a bit cruel, actually. I know that the intention of this book is to create empathy for a character like Eleanor, but so often I feel like the quirkiness of her is exaggerated to the point where I'm guided to laugh at her, in a kind of Jane Austen style, where the character is just exaggerated to the point where no human being would actually think like this. Or if someone thought like this in real life, we wouldn't necessarily feel guilty for having a chuckle at their expense. So I don't know how I feel about this. I really don't know how I feel about this, because it has a mission statement, and I don't know how effectively it does it. And then it kind of goes a bit off the rails too, because suddenly we get these secret big plot twists of things that weren't revealed before, and flashbacks and other things. And how do I feel about spoilers? I'm not going to spoil things. All I'm going to say is that once you've read the book, you'll go, wow, I can't believe they chose this cover. But aside from that, I feel like the plot twists kind of ate away at the text, because it revealed that our protagonist is not an ordinary person. They are a very extraordinary person with extraordinary circumstances that made them the way that they are. And that is just going against that initial premise, right? It's not about the boring person at work. It's now suddenly about Eleanor Oliphant, the extremely unique human being who the universe has conspired to get her into this spot. And I mean, it's fun. People like plot twists. Plot twists make money, and they're memorable. And I saw it coming, but even then, the twist itself is pleasurable to read. And I can imagine, to an extent, the thought process that would have led a debut author to think, oh, my book needs a big plot twist because everyone's going to be so shocked and talking about it. And maybe this has moved the book away from what I want it to be, and that's because it starts with this big mission statement. I wanted it to be a more human, a more reserved story of someone who genuinely is going through this process of loneliness and trying to make connections with others, and I didn't get that. I got instead half a Austen-style exaggerated character satire and half a thriller. But it's fine. It does its job. It's a 3 out of 5. It's an enjoyable read. It's very easy to get through. I finished what was quite a long book in 3 days because of just how efficient the pacing and the plotting and the sentence structure is. But I'm not going to remember it very fondly. I don't think I'm ever going to think about this because thematically it didn't hit any of the notes that I thought it was going to. Really, thematically, it doesn't say anything. It's just fine. It's completely fine. Why would I say that? Alright, and that's my... Oh, it's upside down. Alright, there's my books of November. I can't get myself in the frame probably. And this is getting me right on track to finish 85 books by the end of this year. I will be making some very silly videos on tier lists and stupid facts that I learned through doing this process, and hopefully that will come out in, I want to say January, maybe February. Look, let's be real, I have a lot of ambitions for projects and I don't know if they will ever turn out. So it feels weird for me to say this on recording and then put it out onto the internet, because I don't trust myself to make the things that I want to make, but I'm going to try my best to make some cool things. So stay tuned and thank you for watching, and I will see you in the future. Goodbye!